In the raw autumn of 1884, deep in the wind scoured plains of Dakota Territory, while every homesteader within 30 miles was busy doing the sensible things a man does before the killing season arrives, Elias Thorne was doing none of them. He was not cutting cordwood until his shoulders burned. He was not banking sod against the base of his cabin walls to seal out the drafts. He was not driving heavy plank snow fences into the frozen ground north of his claim the way his neighbors had done for years. Instead, from the first bitter mornings of October, Elias could be found kneeling in the hardening prairie soil with a bundle of young pines and cedars tied across his back, digging holes in patterns that seemed to obey no logic anyone could see. Some of the saplings he set close to the cabin walls. Others he placed nearly 30 feet out, spaced so widely apart that a grown man could walk between them without brushing a branch. Then, without warning, he would tighten the spacing to less than 4 feet, planting 3 trees in a curved cluster that seemed to lean toward the northern ridge, as if listening for something. He measured every gap twice, sometimes 3 times, with a length of knotted rope worn thin at the edges. He drove sharpened cedar stakes into the dirt at angles no carpenter would recognize. He strung short lines of wire between certain trunks and left others completely bare. Nothing about it made sense to the men who stopped their wagons along the trail to watch. Inside the small cabin waited his wife Hannah, 7 months heavy with their second child, and their 11-year-old daughter Clara, who followed her father from row to row with a bucket of creek water and a face pinched red from the cold. Neighbors passing on horseback would slow to a crawl at the sight of the strange rings taking shape around the Thorne homestead. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads and rode on in silence, the way men do when they believe they are looking at the beginning of a tragedy. A few stopped to warn him outright. Wolves needed fences, not gardens. Winter needed firewood, not saplings. A man with a pregnant wife had no business chasing fancy ideas in the last weeks before the snow. But Elias only nodded politely and kept digging. He never argued. He never explained. He simply kept setting trees into the frozen ground with the patient rhythm of a man who had already made his peace with being called a fool. And that patience, that quiet, unhurried certainty, was somehow the most unsettling thing about him. Because the gaps between his trees were not accidents. The odd angles were not mistakes. Every opening, every cluster, every stake had been placed exactly where he wanted it, and no one else in the basin had the faintest idea why. What did Elias Thorne know that his neighbors did not? What secret was he trying to plant into the hard prairie soil before the first real blizzard arrived? Would those thin, fragile saplings become the salvation of his family? Or would they become the grave markers standing above their frozen bodies come spring? Before we go any further into this remarkable story from the American frontier, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what happened around the Thorne cabin that winter changed the way settlers across 3 territories thought about surviving the plains. And you will not want to miss the moment the storm finally came for them. The first man to look at Elias's work and truly stop laughing was an old freight driver named Josiah Merritt, and the day he pulled his wagon beside the Thorne claim would be the first time anyone in the basin suspected there might be more to the strange young homesteader than a wild imagination and a suicidal streak. What Josiah saw in those cedar rings would haunt him for the rest of the winter, and it would take a blizzard of unimaginable violence before anyone else understood why. Josiah Merritt was not a man given to soft words or quick judgments. He had driven freight wagons across the northern plains for nearly 30 years, from the Missouri River clear up into the Canadian territories, and in that time, he had seen more men buried by winter than by any other cause. He had watched blizzards swallow entire wagon trains in a single afternoon. He had helped dig frozen bodies from the eaves of collapsed cabins in the spring thaw. He knew what the plains did to men who underestimated them, and he had grown so tired of burying fools that he no longer bothered to warn them anymore. But something about the Thorne place made him pull his team to a full stop that gray October afternoon. He set the brake on his wagon, climbed down slowly, and walked toward the outermost ring of saplings without saying a word. The wind moved through the young pines with a sound Josiah had heard only twice before in his life. Once in a box canyon outside Miles City, and once in a stand of black spruce along the Milk River, where an old Crow scout had told him the wind sometimes lost its way. Both times, the men Josiah had been traveling with had survived storms that killed everyone else within a day's ride. Elias looked up from the hole he was digging and gave the old freighter a small nod. He did not stop working. He did not offer explanations. He simply kept pressing the frozen dirt around the roots of a young lodgepole pine while Josiah walked the perimeter with the slow, deliberate steps of a man reading a map only he could see. Hannah came to the doorway wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, one hand resting on the swell of her stomach. Clara peeked out from behind her mother's skirts, her breath making pale clouds in the cold air. Neither of them spoke. They had learned in the past 3 weeks that most visitors to the claim came only to mock or to warn, and neither response required an answer from the family. But Josiah did neither. He stopped near the western edge of the outer ring, crouched down, and ran his bare fingers along the base of one of the young cedars. He looked north toward the ridge, where the basin wind gathered its strength before rolling down across the plains. He looked back at the cabin. He looked at the spacing between the trees. And then, very slowly, he stood up and turned toward Elias. "Where'd you learn this?" the old freighter asked. Elias paused for the first time since Josiah had arrived. He rested the shovel handle against his hip and wiped his forehead with the back of his glove. For a long moment, he seemed to weigh how much he wanted to say. Then he answered quietly, "Wyoming, back in '76. I was working for a survey crew running lines for the Union Pacific. We got caught in a January storm north of Rawlins, lost 4 men and 12 mules in one night. But there was an old sheepherder's shack about half a mile from where we camped, tucked behind a broken stand of juniper on a hillside. When we finally dug ourselves out and made it up there looking for help, we found the old man alive, warm, sitting by his stove, drinking coffee like nothing had happened. His shack barely had a drift against the walls." Josiah listened without interrupting. "I stayed with him 3 days waiting for the weather to clear," Elias continued. "He was Basque, come over from the old country as a boy. His grandfather had been a shepherd in the Pyrenees, and his grandfather before that. He told me his family had been reading wind and snow for 400 years. He said the mistake Americans made on the plains was thinking of the wind like an enemy to be blocked. His people thought of it like water. You do not stop a river, you teach it where to flow." Josiah was silent for a long moment. Then he looked once more at the cedar rings surrounding the cabin, and the expression on his weathered face was not amusement. It was something closer to fear. Josiah Merritt did not laugh. He did not shake his head. He did not offer the kind of grim, superior advice that older men so often gave to younger ones on the frontier. Instead, he simply stood there in the cold October wind, looking at the strange rings around the Thorne cabin with an expression Hannah could not read from the doorway. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower than before, almost private, as if he were speaking to himself more than to Elias. "I knew a man once," Josiah said, "up near Fort Buford. Name was Corliss. He built himself a good cabin, thick walls, tight roof, plank fence 40 feet north of the door to catch the drifts. Winter of '71 came through and buried him for 11 days. Fence caught the snow just like it was supposed to. Only problem was, the drift came right over the top of the fence and kept going. Piled up against his walls higher than the eaves. Sealed his chimney shut. They found him in April, sitting at his table with a Bible open in front of him. His wife and boy were in the bed beside him. All 3 of them had been dead since February." Elias said nothing. He had heard versions of that story from a dozen different men across 3 territories. Every homesteader knew someone who had been buried alive by a snow fence built with the best of intentions. Every family carried those names in the quiet parts of their memory. "The fence didn't kill him," Josiah continued. "The fence did exactly what he built it to do. But he built it to fight the storm, and the storm was bigger than his fence. That's what kills men out here. Not the cold. Not the wind. It's the notion that you can stand square against something 10,000 times bigger than you are and win by being stubborn. He looked back at Elias. Your Basque sheep herder. He was right about one thing. You don't fight water, and you sure as hell don't fight winter on these plains. Not head on. For the first time since the conversation began, Elias smiled. It was a small, tired smile. The kind that comes to a man who has spent weeks being called insane and has finally, unexpectedly, been understood by another human being. He set the shovel aside and walked over to where Josiah stood. Come inside, Elias said. Hannah's got coffee on. I'll show you what I'm trying to do. The two men crossed the yard together while Clara watched with wide eyes from the porch. Inside the cabin, warmth pushed back against the raw prairie air. Hannah poured coffee into 2 tin cups without a word, and Elias unrolled a heavy piece of butcher paper across the plank table. On it, drawn in careful pencil lines, was a map of the homestead. The cabin sat at the center. Around it, in 3 staggered rings, were dozens of small circles representing the trees he had planted. Arrows marked the direction of the prevailing winter wind. Numbers indicated the spacing between each sapling, measured in feet and inches. Hatched areas showed where he expected the snow to accumulate, and open channels showed where he had deliberately left drift lanes to bleed the pressure sideways. Josiah stared at the drawing for a long time. He traced one gnarled finger along the outer ring, then along the inner. He studied the angles. He read the small notations Elias had written in the margins. And slowly, very slowly, the old freighter began to nod. You're not building a fence, Josiah said at last. No, Elias answered. You're building a maze. Elias shook his head. A maze traps things. I'm building something that lets the wind pass through, but takes its strength away one piece at a time. Every ring is meant to break the current a little more. By the time it reaches the cabin, it's got nothing left to give. Hannah listened from the stove, her hand resting on her belly. For weeks she had trusted her husband without fully understanding him. Now, watching a hard old freighter study those pencil lines with something close to reverence, she began to feel the first stirring of real hope. Josiah stayed at the Thorne cabin longer than he had intended. The coffee grew cold in his cup while Elias explained the finer points of the design, and the afternoon light through the small window began to turn the color of pewter as the two men bent over the butcher paper drawing. What Elias described was not simply a windbreak. It was a system, layered and deliberate, in which every element depended on every other element to function. The outermost ring, planted roughly 30 feet from the cabin walls, was made almost entirely of young lodgepole pines. These trees, Elias explained, were meant to grow tall and slender, and their job was not to stop the wind, but to lift it. When a strong prairie current struck the outer ring at speed, the vertical trunks and the upper branches would force the hardest part of the flow to rise upward, away from ground level. The wind would not disappear. It would simply be redirected over the top of everything else, arcing across the sky above the cabin like water flowing over a hidden stone in a riverbed. But not all of the wind would be lifted. Some of it, especially the heavier air carrying the packed snow of a real blizzard, would slip beneath the outer ring and continue toward the house. That was where the middle ring came in. The middle ring, planted about 18 feet from the walls, was a mixture of red cedar and white spruce, spaced tighter than the outer ring but not tight enough to form a solid wall. Elias called this the shattering line. Its purpose was to take the wind that had made it past the first ring and break it into smaller, disorganized currents. A single strong wind, he explained to Josiah, was dangerous because it moved with one voice. But once you split it into a dozen smaller winds, each moving at slightly different speeds and angles, they began to interfere with one another. They collided. They canceled each other out. They lost their rhythm, and without rhythm, they lost their ability to carry heavy snow. The innermost ring, only 9 feet from the cabin walls, was the densest of the three. Here, Elias had planted red cedars almost shoulder to shoulder, with barely 3 feet between the trunks. This was the exhaustion line. Whatever remained of the wind by the time it reached this final barrier would be dragged through so much resistance that it would simply give up. The snow it carried would drop harmlessly to the ground before ever touching the walls of the house. But the true genius of the design, Elias said, was not in the three rings themselves. It was in the spaces between them. Between the outer ring and the middle ring, and again between the middle ring and the innermost ring, he had left broad open corridors of empty ground. These corridors, he explained, were where the real work happened. When the wind was lifted by the outer ring and then dropped down between the rings, it entered a zone of dead air. It could not maintain its speed. It could not maintain its direction. It began to spin in slow, disorganized eddies, and every foot it traveled in that dead zone stole another portion of its strength. Josiah traced one of the corridors with his finger. And the gaps in the rings themselves? Drift lanes, Elias said. The snow has to go somewhere. If I sealed the rings all the way around, the drifts would just build higher and higher against the outer trees until they buried the whole system. So I left specific openings, angled away from the cabin where the pressure can escape. The snow gets pushed sideways instead of piling up on top of us. Josiah leaned back in his chair. He looked at Hannah, then at Clara, who had come in from the porch and was sitting cross-legged by the stove, listening to every word. He looked at the drawing again. And then he did something no man in the basin had ever seen him do. He took off his hat, laid it on the table, and rubbed both hands slowly across his face. Elias, he said finally, if this works, you're going to change how men live out here. Elias did not answer at once. He looked down at the pencil drawing on the butcher paper, at the small circles that represented his trees, and then out the window toward the darkening prairie where the real trees stood rooted in the frozen dirt. The wind was picking up again outside, pushing dry leaves along the ground in short, nervous bursts. If it works, he said quietly. Josiah nodded slowly. He understood the weight of that qualifier better than most men could have. The frontier had swallowed a great many good ideas over the years, and it had swallowed them along with the families who had trusted them. A theory that survived a single winter was still only a theory. A theory that survived 10 winters became wisdom. A theory that failed once, even once, was buried alongside the men who had believed in it. The old freighter finished his coffee, gathered his hat, and stood. Before he left, he did something else Hannah had not expected. He walked over to where Clara sat by the stove, crouched down until his eyes were level with hers, and spoke to her in the soft voice men use with children they respect. You listen to your father, little one, Josiah said. He sees things most men don't, and he's got the courage to build what he sees, even when everybody else tells him he's a fool. You remember that when you're older. The people who change the world are almost always called fools first. Clara nodded solemnly. Josiah touched the brim of his hat to Hannah, clasped Elias's hand with a grip that carried the weight of 40 winters, and then walked out into the cold with his shoulders bent against the rising wind. For a long time after his wagon had rolled out of sight, no one in the cabin spoke. Elias rolled up the butcher paper drawing and slid it back into the wooden case where he kept his notes. Hannah moved to the stove and began preparing supper. Clara returned to the small pile of kindling she had been sorting by the hearth. But the mood inside the small cabin had changed. For the first time since the planning began, a stranger had looked at their work and seen not madness, but purpose. It was a small thing, perhaps, but on the frontier, a small thing could be the difference between despair and endurance. 2 days later, the wind changed direction. It came now not from the northwest, as it had for most of October, but from due north, straight down off the high ridge, and it carried with it the first true cold of the season. The temperature fell by 20 degrees between sunrise and noon. Puddles that had been slush at dawn were solid ice by afternoon. The chickens huddled together in the small coop behind the cabin and refused to come out even when Clara scattered grain for them. Every living thing on the plains seemed to understand that something was coming. Elias worked harder than ever in those days. He had finished the planning itself nearly 2 weeks earlier, but there was still work to be done, and he attacked it with the desperation of a man who knew that time was no longer on his side. He hauled buckets of creek water out to the youngest saplings and packed the earth around their roots with fresh straw to keep the ground from freezing solid too quickly. He walked the perimeter of the outer ring 3 times a day, checking for weak trees, replacing any that had been damaged by early frost or by the constant probing of the basin wind. He drove additional cedar stakes into the ground beside the more fragile saplings and lashed them together with strips of rawhide to give the young trunks something to lean against when the real storms came. Hannah watched him from the cabin window during those days, and she began to notice something she had not noticed before. Elias was not just working, he was praying. Not with words, not with folded hands, but with every motion of his body. Every carefully packed handful of dirt, every measured step between the rings, every glance toward the northern sky. The first real test came on the 4th of November. It was not the great blizzard Elias had been preparing for, but it was enough to reveal the weaknesses in his design, and it came with the kind of suddenness that had killed 1,000 homesteaders before him. The morning began clear and cold, with a pale sun rising over ground so frozen that Clara's small boots made no impression at all when she ran out to feed the chickens. By midday, the sun had disappeared behind a wall of cloud so low and gray that it seemed to press down on the roof of the cabin. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind had risen to a howl. By dusk, the snow was falling sideways. Elias stood at the north-facing window of the cabin, watching. He did not go outside. He did not try to reinforce anything. There was nothing more to be done. The system he had spent 2 months building would either work or it would not, and no amount of last-minute effort would change the outcome now. Hannah sat by the stove with Clara curled against her side, one hand resting on the round curve of her belly. The child inside her was moving, kicking softly against the walls of her body, as if it too could sense the storm. For nearly 7 hours, the wind hammered against the plains. It was not a full blizzard, not yet, but it was the strongest system anyone in the basin had seen since the previous winter, and it came from the north with a fury that shook the shutters and rattled the tin cups on their pegs above the stove. Elias watched from the window and made careful notes in a small leather journal by the light of the lantern. He noted the direction of the wind, the intensity of the gusts, the way the snow moved through the outer ring of pines. And it was there, at the outer ring, that he saw the first problem. The wind was coming down from the north, exactly as he had designed for. But it was not moving in a single, clean current the way he had assumed it would. It was moving in waves, in pulses, in sudden violent bursts that changed direction slightly with each new gust. And in one section of the outer ring, on the northwestern edge where the ground sloped down toward a shallow draw, the wind was doing something Elias had not anticipated. Instead of being lifted upward by the young pines, it was slipping beneath them and rolling along the ground in a low, fast current that carried snow directly toward the corner of the cabin where the goat shed stood. By morning, when the storm had finally passed and Elias stepped outside to survey the damage, he found exactly what he had feared. The goat shed was buried nearly to the roof. The snow had piled against the northwest corner of the cabin itself in a hard, packed drift that reached higher than Clara's head. 2 of the young pines in the outer ring had been bent nearly flat by the pressure. One had snapped clean at the trunk, its splintered stump sticking up out of the snow like an accusing finger. Elias stood in the cold morning light and looked at the wreckage of his design without speaking. Hannah came out onto the porch wrapped in her heaviest shawl, and Clara followed a moment later. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. The failure was written plainly across the ground in front of them. For a long moment, Elias simply breathed. The air was so cold it hurt his lungs. He looked at the buried shed, and then at the drift against the cabin wall, and then at the broken pine, and he understood something that no amount of theory could have taught him. His design had assumed the wind would behave like a river. But the wind was not a river. It was something wilder, something less predictable. And any system built to survive it would have to account for that unpredictability. He turned to Hannah. "I got it wrong," he said quietly. "Not all of it, but enough." Hannah did not answer at once. She looked at her husband's face, at the small lines of exhaustion around his eyes, at the way his shoulders had sagged just slightly beneath his heavy coat. And she understood that this moment mattered more than the broken pine or the buried shed. A man who had spent 2 months being called insane by everyone in the basin had just come face to face with the possibility that they might have been right. What she said now, in this small window of morning silence, would either give him the strength to continue or take it away entirely. She stepped down off the porch and walked out into the snow until she was standing beside him. She did not touch him. She did not offer comfort. She simply stood next to him and looked out at the same damaged landscape he was looking at. "How much of it worked?" she asked. Elias blinked. It was not the question he had expected. He had expected sympathy, or perhaps quiet doubt, or perhaps even the beginning of an argument about whether they should abandon the design and build a proper snow fence before the real winter came. But Hannah was not asking any of those things. She was asking him to look past the failure and count what had succeeded. He turned slowly and let his eyes travel across the homestead. The cabin itself was standing untouched, except for that single drift on the northwestern corner. The middle ring of cedars had held perfectly. The innermost ring, closest to the walls, was barely disturbed. The corridors of dead air between the rings had done their work in 3 out of the 4 directions. Snow had piled where he had wanted it to pile, in the outer drift zones far from the house. The chimney was clear. The front door had opened easily that morning without any digging. Most of it, he said slowly. Most of it worked. Then most of it will work again, Hannah said. You fix the part that didn't, and you keep the parts that did. Elias looked at her for a long moment. He had married her 7 years earlier in a small Methodist church in eastern Iowa, and in all that time he had never once doubted her steadiness. But standing there in the cold morning after his first real failure, he understood something he had not fully understood before. Hannah was not merely steady. She was the reason the whole thing could keep going. Without her, the failure of a single night would have been enough to end it. With her, no single failure could be enough. He nodded slowly. I need to move the outer pines on the northwest edge closer together, and I need to plant a second row behind them to catch the low currents that slipped underneath. I should have accounted for the slope. The draw creates a channel the wind can ride down into. Then that's what you do today, Hannah said. And so he did. He spent the entire day, from first light until the sun disappeared again behind the western ridge, digging out the broken pine and replacing it with 2 new ones he had held in reserve for exactly this purpose. He moved 4 other saplings from the outer ring inward by nearly 3 feet, tightening the spacing along the northwestern edge. He drove additional cedar stakes into the frozen ground and lashed the young trees together for support. He worked until his hands were bleeding through his gloves and his back had gone stiff with cold. And when he finally came inside at dusk, Hannah had a bowl of hot stew waiting for him at the table. Clara helped him that day in ways she had not helped before. She was old enough now to understand what had happened, and she carried the wire and the stakes and the coils of rawhide back and forth between the cabin and the outer ring with the seriousness of a small soldier. She did not ask questions. She did not complain about the cold. She simply worked beside her father, and when he stopped occasionally to rest, she stopped with him. That night, after Clara had gone to sleep, Hannah sat with Elias by the stove. Hannah waited until she was sure Clara's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of true sleep before she spoke. The stove had burned down to a bed of red coals, and the small cabin was as warm as it would ever be during a Dakota November night. Outside, the wind had died to a low, steady breath that moved through the cedar rings with a sound almost like distant water. Elias, she said quietly, if the real storm comes and this doesn't hold, what do we do? It was the question neither of them had spoken aloud in all the weeks of planting. Elias had known it was there, moving beneath every conversation they had, but Hannah had never asked it directly until now. He set down the small knife he had been using to sharpen a cedar stake and looked at her across the flickering lantern light. We won't have time to do anything else, he said honestly. If the design fails in a real blizzard, we won't be digging our way out. We'll be sitting in this cabin waiting for it to end. And whether we live or die will depend on how much wood is inside these walls when it starts. Hannah nodded. She had known that already. She had known it since the first day he had drawn the pencil lines on the butcher paper. But there was something about hearing it said aloud that made the weight of it settle differently in her chest. "Then I want you to promise me something," she said. "Anything if it fails. I don't want you to blame yourself. I don't want you to sit here and count the mistakes and tell yourself you should have built a plank fence like Josiah's brother-in-law. I don't want you to spend our last hours apologizing to me for trying something new. Do you understand?" Elias did not answer right away. He looked at the woman he had married, at the swell of the child inside her, and at the small dark shape of their sleeping daughter across the room. And he felt something in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite pride, but something made from both. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I promise," he said. "Good," Hannah said. And then, after a pause, "Because I trust what you built, Elias. I trust it more than I would trust 100 plank fences. I have watched you work for 2 months, and I have seen the way you think about the wind. If any man in this territory can build something that will hold, it is you." He did not know what to say to that. So he simply held her hand, and for a long time the two of them sat in the small pool of lantern light and listened to the steady breath of the prairie wind moving through the cedars outside. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange, suspended calm. The weather stayed cold but clear. Snow fell twice in light dustings that barely covered the ground. And the wind never rose above what a man could walk comfortably against. Elias used the time to finish every last detail of the design. He hauled the last of the firewood into the corridor between the middle and inner rings, stacking it in long, low piles that would serve a double purpose. The wood would be close at hand during the winter, and its bulk would add another layer of wind-breaking mass close to the cabin walls. He also did something else during those 3 weeks, something he did not tell Hannah about until it was finished. On the northern edge of the outer ring, at the exact point where the previous storm had found its weakness, he dug a shallow trench about 18 inches deep and 20 feet long. He filled the trench with loose brush and dead branches he had gathered from along the creek. Then he covered it with a thin layer of soil. From above, it looked like nothing at all. But when a low wind current came sliding down the slope of the draw, that trench would catch it, tumble it, and rob it of its speed before it ever reached the young pines. The great blizzard of 1884 arrived on the evening of December 17th. It did not creep in the way lesser storms sometimes did, giving men time to bank their fires and count their livestock. It came all at once, out of a clear, cold sky, in a way that men who survived it would still be talking about 40 years later. One moment the sun was setting behind the western ridge in a long band of pale gold. The next moment, the northern horizon had turned the color of wet slate, and within an hour the entire basin was swallowed by a wall of moving white that reduced visibility to less than 3 feet. Elias had been outside splitting the last of the day's kindling when he saw it coming. He did not waste a second. He gathered the axe and the small pile of split wood and made 3 fast trips across the yard, hauling everything into the cabin before the first hard gust struck. Hannah had already barred the shutters. Clara had already pulled the heavy wool blankets down from the loft. Every member of the family knew, without being told, that the moment had come. The wind hit the outer ring of pines with a sound Hannah would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a howl. It was not a roar. It was something deeper than either, a low, sustained thunder that seemed to come from every direction at once. The cabin shook. The lantern on the table swayed on its hook. Dust from the rafters drifted down in slow gray streams. And then, very slowly, something remarkable happened. The thunder outside began to change its character. It did not grow quieter, not exactly, but it began to break apart. The single sustained voice of the wind fractured into a dozen smaller voices, each moving at a slightly different pitch and speed. Elias, standing at the north-facing window, with his face pressed close to the shutter, could hear the outer ring lifting the strongest currents upward. He could hear the middle ring shattering what remained into disorganized eddies. He could hear the innermost ring dragging the last of the energy out of the wind before it ever touched the cabin walls. The system was working. It was working exactly as he had drawn it on the butcher paper 2 months earlier. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm hammered the plains. Men in cabins 20 miles away would later report drifts that reached higher than their rooflines, chimneys sealed shut with ice, doors that could not be opened until spring. 2 entire families in the northern part of the county were found dead in the thaw. One of them still sitting at their supper table with the food frozen to their plates. It was, by every measure that mattered, one of the worst blizzards in the recorded history of the Dakota Territory. Inside the Thorne cabin, life continued in a strange, suspended calm. The stove burned steadily through the night and into the morning. Hannah made stew from the salted pork and the last of the autumn potatoes. Clara sat by the fire with a slate and practiced her letters. Elias watched from the window and made his careful notes in the leather journal. On the second night of the storm, Hannah felt the first true contractions begin, and Elias understood that the child was going to come during the blizzard, whether he was ready or not. But even that terror, when it arrived, did not break them. Hannah labored through the long dark hours with a courage that made her husband weep quietly in the corners of the room where she could not see him. Just before dawn on the third day, while the storm still raged outside and the wind still thundered against the cedar rings, a son was born into the small warm cabin. Elias caught him in his own hands. Clara held her mother's fingers and did not let go. The baby cried once, a small clear sound, and then settled against Hannah's chest and began to nurse. Outside, the wind kept blowing, but it could not reach them. The trees had done what Elias had asked them to do, and inside the walls his family was safe. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 20th of December, Elias opened the cabin door and stepped out into a world he barely recognized. The prairie beyond the outer ring of pines had been transformed into a vast, unbroken sea of hard-packed white that reached in some places nearly to the tops of the young trees. Drifts curled around the outer edge of the homestead in long, sculpted waves, as if some enormous hand had shaped the snow deliberately. In 2 spots, along the drift lanes Elias had designed, the pressure of the storm had blown clean channels through the accumulation, exactly where he had wanted the snow to escape. But inside the rings, the ground was almost bare. A soft covering of powder lay across the yard, no more than a few inches deep in any direction. The path between the cabin and the goat shed was still visible. The chimney was clear. The front door had opened at a single push. The trees themselves, all 73 of them, still stood rooted in the frozen earth. A few were bent. A handful of branches had snapped. But not one had been uprooted, and not one had failed at the moment it had been needed. Elias walked slowly through the corridors between the rings, and the silence inside the sheltered space was so complete that he could hear his own breath. Beyond the outer pines, the wind still moved across the plains in the long, exhausted breaths that always followed a great storm. But here, in the small pocket of stillness he had built for his family, nothing moved at all except the thin gray line of smoke rising straight up from the chimney into a sky the color of pale glass. Josiah Merritt arrived on horseback 3 days later, once the trails were passable again. He had ridden past 4 abandoned homesteads on his way, cabins with their chimneys buried and their doors sealed shut, and he had not expected to find the Thornes alive. When he crested the rise overlooking the claim and saw the smoke rising straight into the sky, he pulled his horse to a stop and simply stared. Then he came the rest of the way slowly, as a man approaches something holy. Elias met him at the outer ring. Neither man spoke at first. Josiah dismounted, walked the perimeter as he had done on that October afternoon, and studied the drift patterns with the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years reading snow. When he finally turned back to Elias, there were tears frozen in the old freighter's beard. "You did it," Josiah said. "You actually did it." Elias only nodded. Inside the cabin, Hannah was nursing the baby by the stove. Clara was showing Josiah's shape at the window and calling out that Mr. Merritt had come. The small boy, whom they would name Samuel after Hannah's father, would grow up to be a farmer in this same basin and would live to see the beginning of another century. The Thorn cabin stood for more than 50 years after that winter. The cedar rings grew tall and thick, and travelers on the northern trail would point them out from miles away, a dark green island of shelter in the middle of the empty plains. Homesteaders from 3 counties came to study the design. Some of them copied it. A few improved on it. By the turn of the century, versions of what had become known simply as the Thorn Rings could be found scattered across the Dakotas, Montana, and parts of Wyoming, each one a small monument to a man who had refused to fight the wind and had chosen instead to teach it where to flow. Elias Thorn lived to be 78 years old. He is buried beside Hannah in a small family plot at the edge of what was once the outer ring of pines. The trees still stand. So the question we leave you with is this. Was Elias Thorn a genius, or was he simply a man humble enough to listen to what the frontier had been trying to teach everyone all along? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who loves stories of quiet courage, and subscribe to the channel for more untold tales from the American frontier. Until next time, peace.